This is Paul Johnson with the New Frontiers. We're back today with another episode with the noted economist Elliott Pollack, as well as the syndicated columnist Bob Robb, and finally Professor Henry Tompson. Today, we're going to have a talk about the economic policies of both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, and to do a comparison of each one of them. Now, we're going to go back and forth on each one of them. I'll give you a hint. I'm calling this show that it's bad politics, but it's disastrous economics, the policies of both of them. It's bad politics because it's definitely not appealing to those people who are in the center in those 5 states that politically they need to appeal to. But it's terrible or disastrous economics because these policies actually would do damage to the overall quality of life of Americans inside the United States. Take a listen to both. I think you'll hear where both of them have challenges, and you'll also gain a better idea of why some of those policies end up being political problems for both of them. Again, this is Paul Johnson. Now, I'm just an ordinary American who still believes that the United States is a cause for good. If you like what it is that we're talking about on this show, go ahead and press that subscribe button and let's get going.
Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Well, gentlemen, I'd like to welcome all of you back to another series on the New Frontiers, and I'm going to start with Elliott Pollack. Elliott's going to kind of be the star of the show today because we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the economic proposals of both Kamala as well as Donald Trump, and we're going to try to dig into the weeds on those. But before we do, we're going to talk a little bit about the convention. We're going to talk about Kamala's speech because the last show that we did was right before that. Obviously, Henry, you can see his hair is a little disheveled today. He's got 2 kids, a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old and a 9-month-old, and he spent Memorial Weekend trying to chase around both of them for most of the weekend. He seems a little tired and exhausted, but you're getting there, Henry. Just get back into class, I guess. And then finally, my favorite columnist in the United States, which is Bob Robb. I love reading his columns. And Bob, I am going to start with you because you wrote a great column this weekend that I want to talk about before we get into the economic proposals. And it was about the end of wokeism. Now, where I'd like to start with that is I keep thinking I know what wokeism actually is, but I hear many of my friends on the left who say all wokeism really is an awareness or an awakening. I tend to see it more as kind of a postmodern version of anti-modernity. It's a very negative, pessimistic point of view that tends to lead us or wants to drive us towards socialism. But if you would, before you describe what you talked about in the column, would you talk about how you view wokeism, how you view the word itself?
There is a distinction between the traditional civil rights movement and the traditional case for affirmative action with the wokeism ideology that has seized control of our institutions of higher education, and many of our largest corporations have elements of it. And the distinction is this: the traditional civil rights movement and the traditional case for affirmative action viewed the United States as, in essence, a positive and favorable enterprise, and characterized by aspirations and the reality of being a meritocracy. And the traditional civil rights movement and the traditional case for affirmative action simply sought to expand access to that fundamentally good American meritocracy. Wokeism rejects the notion that the United States is essentially a positive enterprise and denies the existence of meritocracy. It regards our high-sounding principles, founding principles of natural rights, rule of law, separation of powers, as a facade to uphold white male supremacy, and that it was designed and constructed for that purpose, and it continues to exist to preserve and perpetuate that. It really is more of a radical and a revolutionary point of view. And it has benefited from precisely, Paul, the reaction that you described and that I hear every time that I write about it, that no, it's just being aware that some people start out with disadvantages and wanting to correct for those disadvantages. It is something very, very different and perniciously so. And one of the things that I found uplifting about the Democratic Convention was the extent to which it was imbued with celebrations of what makes America good, and in particular, Kamala Harris's speech, which ended by saying, "We belong to the greatest democracy in the history of the world, and we have the greatest privilege of any human beings who have walked the face of this earth by being born and being Americans." That completely repudiates and rebukes the founding premises of wokeism as distinguished from the traditional civil rights movement and the traditional case for affirmative action. I don't support the traditional case, but it is, again, wanting to expand access to the American meritocracy, while wokeism rejects the existence of such.
Yeah, for me, when I look at it from a philosophical standpoint, I think that it is so strongly linked to postmodernism. You almost cannot delink it. They're strongly connected. Postmodernism, if you try to think about what is postmodernism, you have to almost start with, well, what's modernism? Because this is obviously the counter to that. Modernism is something that's been around for 300-400 years, and it's based upon this idea that we began to see all these amazing changes that began to take place in science and technology and healthcare and medicine. The scientific method began to become something that was important. We saw changes that happened in automobiles and transportation, communication, data collection, even the form of government, which believed in more people engaging, more free speech, more advancement from the individual itself. Socialism wasn't originally an economic theory. Socialism was really just the idea of, should you support the collective or should you support the individual? And there's some argument that says, I was listening to a speaker talk about this who pointed out that Catholicism was more socialistic than Protestantism, because Catholicism believed that there was a hierarchy and you needed to work out all your problems or all your disagreements with the theocracy within that column. Whereas Protestants said, no, you go just form a different denomination and we can go ahead and have a disagreement. But the question is, were you bound socially or connected socially to the other group? And should that be your primary focus, the collective, or should it be the individual? What we saw with communism, it was a direct attack on what was happening with modernity. But interestingly enough, what Karl Marx did is he took that socialistic concept and he applied an economic theory to it. And he actually applied science. He said, hey, there's this idea of the dialectic. There's a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis. And effectively, I guess it was Hegel's theory, he said that what happens is that as you began to look at slavery, it was confronted with land ownership and farmers, and then that became a feudalistic system with knights and nobles and serfs, and eventually that was confronted with the bourgeois, the people who confronted that, and then eventually it would lead to the proletariat doing the same thing. He believed that there was a scientific process to that happening. The problem was, It never worked. Every place they tried it, they had to kill tens of millions of people to even attempt to make it work. It always failed. I think what happened was that intellectually, within our colleges and universities and academic environments, there were a group of people who still wanted to believe in those theories of socialism and communism, but they were confronted by facts and data that said, it's just not effective. It doesn't work. And so this postmodern idea became the way to attack everything in modernity. Everything that was happening, from the scientific method to democracy, to say that all of it was just simply a grand narrative. And by the way, the intellectuals who put this together in the beginning, they came from the far left. Although I'm not altogether certain that it's only a left ideology. I think that there are people on the far right who do not want to buy into the grand narrative that all people are created equal. Interestingly enough, I think there's a coalition on both sides. But wokeism, whether it came from postmodernism or the evolution of that, the critical race theory to wokeism, it buys into the idea that you need to destroy the existing system to make it work because it only services the patriarchy. I agree with you. One of the interesting things, I didn't really catch on to it until I read your article, but what was fascinating about the convention is the idea that you can be upbeat about the United States is an anathema to that whole concept. It doesn't work within that concept.
Absolutely. And it was a distinguishing feature of the convention, and I believe consciously so. I think it does perhaps represent at least a political turning point to reducing the hold wokeism has had on the intelligentsia of our country and the infection that's occurred in some of our big corporations and the traditional media. That had begun to retreat anyway, but either from sincerity or political calculation, and it really doesn't matter which, I thought that was one of the more significant lessons coming out of the Democratic Convention, the extent to which they embraced the American creed.
Yeah, and to me, the most exciting part about it, it certainly speaks well for our country, the idea that we move away from this victim mentality that blames our founders for everything that's gone wrong in the world instead of seeing the benefits that they gave us. But more importantly, the constituencies that the Democrats represent, it shouldn't be lost on anybody. Our prisons are filled with people with a victim mentality. It's filled with it, right? It's filled with people who believe that they're victims. The answer is, if you're a victim, you have no agency. If you have no agency, you have no way of fixing your problems. And the answer to that is, that's incorrect. You have all the capability that you would like to be able to fix the problem. It takes hard work. It's going to take commitment. It may take education, but it's there if you want it.
I think that Rob did definitely point to something that was distinctive about the Democratic Convention, which was this really striking rah-rah-rah nationalism that also I was a little taken aback by. But I wouldn't really read too much philosophical meaning into the nationalism. I think that's really, to be honest, a political expediency, and I view the conventions in general as kind of a form of pageantry. And so I think that the Democrats have realized that by ceding the ground of patriotism to the Republicans, that was maybe too much of a concession, and that the nationalist sentiment in the US, like everywhere in the world, is just so strong. And people do love their country, and it's so normal to do so, that they had to backpedal a little bit on that. So I think that it was kind of a stylistic or a cosmetic adjustment there for the convention. Whether that changes anything really about the way that the Democratic Party and affiliated elites think about the world, I'd be a little more dubious. But you're right, Bob. Really striking display of nationalism at that convention that I was not really expecting, I have to say.
And Henry, is your view, I mean, I hear nationalism. It's funny because every time I hear the word nationalism, I go immediately to the concept of the Nazis, the fascist movement that took place during the 1930s and the 1940s. But my guess is there's some nationalism that's actually necessary for people to feel proud of who they are and where they come from. Would you agree with that or disagree, especially in all that you've done in looking at history?
Well, nationalism is often associated with the right now because of the Nazis, right? But nationalist movements weren't always right-wing movements. Nationalist movements, by definition, are neither left-wing or right-wing. They are about securing the independence of a certain national group, and normally those groups are defined by culture and language. You know, you see in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, and even in Western Europe, right? These, you know, the French nation had to be constructed as a political project. It didn't exist. If you go back to the 19th century, early 19th century, the French nation didn't exist. This was a group of different people speaking different languages. The same thing goes for Germany. The nationalists of the mid-20th century were often in opposition to communists who were universalists, right? They tried to say that it didn't matter whether you were a German worker or a Russian worker. What mattered is that you're a worker, and that's where the affiliation of nationalism with the right comes from. Today, there's a lot of that baggage carried still by nationalists, and that's why I think that a lot of the nationalism that we're seeing in the last 10 or 15 years did come first from the right? You know, the Brexit movement, the movement for Trump. We can look at other countries too. You know, the German Nationalist Party, the right-wing extremist nationalist party that just won a state election in Germany this weekend. They also come from the right. But there's no reason, you know, in general, why left-wing parties can't adopt some nationalism for their own purposes, and indeed they often do. I mean, why not? There's nothing stopping you, and patriotism is a very strong instinct in most people around the world. So, there's no real reason why nationalism as a political strategy is closed off to the left at the moment, apart from that they think that it's negative. And as Bob described, a lot of their ideology is based around the nation states as we see them today, being based on racism, misogyny, oppression of workers, etc. That's how they view nationalism. But if they tone that down a little bit, there's of course huge reserves of nationalist sentiment and patriotism that the left can draw upon just as much as the right, should they see fit. And I think that's what they were doing at the convention, was trying to use a little bit of that, you know, patriotism that's widespread in America as much as anywhere else, to their own advantage.
Elliott, did you watch the speech? Any thoughts on it?
I watched the speech, and I thought it was political. If you take a look at her economic program, it is the antithesis of what Americans have as an economy, or has had for 200 years. You can't look at things in a vacuum. Wokeism looks at things in a vacuum. You look at as long as the world has humans in it, it will not be perfect. It's not a chance in the world. But America was the only country ever designed to protect its people from its government, and not its government from its people. And that worked superbly for probably 200 years. It's had some attacks on it recently. Wokeism is a massive attack on that. Geez, it's not perfect. And all these guys who got us here were not perfect. Well, welcome to the human race. That's the way it is. But the basic structure of the U.S. was so different than every other country that ever existed that it allowed people to flourish, to do their own thing, to get together voluntarily, to make voluntary purchases, to not be controlled by their government. And it is mind-boggling that wokeism was actually, the country got to the point where we are even discussing this, because it's just, in my opinion, ridiculous. And is it getting cured? Sure, it's getting cured. But the cure sometimes is worse than the problem. And we can talk about that at length later. Bob might disagree with me on that one. But I will tell you that an economy that anybody who's saying we need price controls, high energy costs, more regulation, and more government handouts, that's a lot of government calling the shots, and that's just never worked in America. It's worked in Europe, and that's why it's now socialist democracies in Europe. I agree with you. I will say that not only is Marx is great, except for only one little itsy bitsy thing. He was wrong. He missed the point. He doesn't understand human beings. It's ridiculous that is even being taught in schools at this point because it's wrong. So the one thing that basically free enterprise economies have with less government is a history of great results for the average person. The increase in the standard of living of every human on this planet owns its core at its core that increase to a free enterprise system. America is rich because of that free enterprise system. The average poor person today is better off than the average rich person was 80 years ago, maybe 50 years ago. So I look at the whole woke thing and I just shake my head. But Harris's plan and what she said at the convention don't match.
All right. So here's what I'm hoping that we can do today. By the way, any other comments on this before we move on to the economic side?
No.
All right. So what I'd like to do, Elliott, is I'd like to try to focus on each one of the proposals, and I'll give my opinion on both up front, and then certainly everybody can opine on how they see either of their proposals in general. But I really want to get into the specifics of each one. My own personal opinion is that I happen to think that not only are both of their plans bad politics, both of their plans are disastrous economics. Now, that doesn't mean they'll get them implemented. Certainly, they're going to have to deal with a bipartisan House, and they're going to have to deal with the reality of being president. But in some of these items, they actually could be more successful than others in either getting them through Congress or by doing them through executive order. The reason that I think that they're disastrous economics is because they don't pay attention to free market principles that are key to making our country work. But the reason I think they're bad politics is different. I believe, I've seen a lot of polling on this, if you take the independents who are unaffiliated, the unaffiliated group of people who are still truly persuadable, let's not call them undecided, but at least persuadable, there are two groups. There's one group who is a very low efficacy voter. That low efficacy voter, they tend to believe that that everything is terrible, the world is a disaster, their life is a wreck, and somebody must have caused it. Somebody must have created that environment. It is a low efficacy voter. You may be able to appeal to them, and if you appeal to them, you may be able to get them to vote. But the overwhelming majority of those unaffiliated voters are neither anti-free market, nor are they a believer that there should be no role that government should play. They believe in education, and they believe that government should play a role in providing a defense and having police departments and fire departments and all those other things. But they're not anti-free market. In fact, they believe in the free market. They believe that maybe those two principles work together. And in general, what I've seen in polling from them is that group tends to believe that on one hand, the Democrats may not be in alignment with their economic interests, and they see that the Republicans may not be in alignment with their ability to keep voting. So they're challenged by both parties. Now, some of that polling was pre-Kamala, but the point I'm giving to you is that group, I think if you're going to appeal to them, a more free market message is more appealing. And I don't see that coming from either candidate. But if we can, let's break these down. And because you started with Kamala, we'll start with hers first, although we're going to try to be fair and hit the proposals of both. Elliott, talk to me about this concept of, let's start with the tax proposal. The tax proposal that would apply a tax to income that had not yet actually been received through stocks and other items. Can you talk to me about that proposal and what it does and why you see that as being a challenge?
Well, it's a tax on unrealized capital gains. And it has been tried in other places and almost immediately abandoned because it is not functional. One, you'll spend as much money trying to figure out what the value of the assets is as what the value of the assets is. It's appraisals it's incredibly difficult to come up with realistic values without spending lots of money. And that's just unfair. Two, the thing about unrealized gains, what happens when when you lose the gains? Do you get a refund? And do you get a refund at the tax rate in the year you paid the taxes? Or if taxes go up or down, do you get it? When do you get it? Three, it will, no matter what you say, it's going to force some people to have to sell assets or businesses or farms to pay that tax. And that just, again, is not fair. And I just have nothing good to say about that proposal. It is not workable. It's been tried. It's failed everywhere it's been tried. Why are we wasting our time? It's nonsense.
So the Democrats or Kamala seems to have tried to create some counter to the objections that you might have to it. As an example, by setting the dollar amount very, very high, so it's only affecting, quote unquote, the rich. And the dollar amount seemed to be a high amount.
Just keep in mind that the income tax in 1913 was supposed to only affect the rich.
Right.
Keep that in mind.
But let's say that they were successful. Let's just play out that they were successful, because I think there are challenges even if they were. The challenge to me on this proposal says, okay, so if you take people who are high net worth people and you say to them, here's what we're going to do to you. We're going to take your income. We're going to go try to figure out what the value of your stock is. We're going to give you a 5-year period of time to try to reconcile it, but we're going to tax you on that unearned income, which means that you have to sell the stock. Aren't we creating in that environment a disincentive for people to invest in the economic stack? Aren't we creating an incentive for them not to become shareholders, not to become stockholders? And doesn't that have a negative effect, a negative overall impact on the economy long term?
Her whole program is anti-higher output. And you need higher output, especially output per capita, to have a higher standard of living. In my opinion, if you didn't have a split government and that was enacted, you're going to have a lower standard of living 8 years from now than you have today. And that's something I don't think I've ever said before. But the answer is, across the board, it's incentives not to work. It's higher energy costs, higher price controls, more regulation, an array of government handouts. It's just anti-productivity. Now, if you're a rich guy, you really are important to the system because it's your savings that create the money that new businesses borrow to become strong and healthy. And that won't happen. Also, if it becomes too difficult to become rich, you either basically find a way around it, either by leaving the country or by some other subterfuge, or you just don't create the jobs. And as you're talking about, the capital wouldn't exist to the extent it does now to create the jobs that make big businesses and make people, or allow people to have incomes as workers, high incomes as workers. It is counterproductive. I don't get it. And by the way, we don't have a taxing problem in this country. We have a spending problem. And they're not even addressing the real problem, which is spending, not taxing.
Yeah. Bob, you've opined on this in the past, which is the disconnect that exists between, even if you were to implement many of these taxes, it wouldn't address the spending issue. But I'd love your thoughts on this particular issue.
Let me make a political observation and then a point on the specific proposal. The Biden budget had a whole suite of tax increases. In addition to this one, an increase in the personal income tax rate, an increase in the corporate income tax rate, and they would have all the effects, cumulative and individually, that Elliott mentioned in terms of being an anchor on productive investment and activity. By default, Harris is not separating herself from that suite of tax increases in the Biden budget. But interestingly, she's not really running on them. She doesn't mention them. She doesn't bring them up. So I'm not sure that she's as wedded to the entire suite of them as Biden was. But she can't really disassociate herself from them. But politically, she doesn't seem to be emphasizing them or running on them. In terms of the specific unrealized capital gains, to accentuate a point that Elliott made, when you limit it to only those very rich, at the very rich level, they tend to have more of their portfolio in assets that are difficult to value, as Elliott described. The average Joe has stocks, and there's a daily value that's associated with them. Trying to tax it would have all the negative consequences that Elliott described. But when you get to the upper income, you have ownership of private corporations that aren't publicly traded. You've got art, you've got a variety of different investments. And so all the problems that Elliott mentioned in terms of administration become 10 to 20 times more severe when you get to people at the very top echelon of the socioeconomic ladder. And they also have plenty of money to hire accountants to argue with the IRS interminably over what the value at any particular point in time of assets that aren't readily marketable might be.
I'm going to refer to one of Bob's Substack pieces that I read recently, in which he emphasized that this campaign seems to be mostly about shoring up the respective bases on either side. And when I look at some of these economic proposals, I don't really know whether they're serious economic proposals or whether they're kind of red meat that are being thrown out to the progressive left in order to make sure that they turn up for the election in November. And so whether it's the capital gains tax idea or the handouts for people to buy homes or the ideas, potential price controls, I don't think that these are actually well considered or thought out ideas that are supposed to be debated, the merits of them, by serious people. I think this is just a series of ideas that have been kicking around on the far left for a very long time. As Elliott notes, they have not been implemented with any success anywhere ever. But there's a lot of people on the very far left that still find these appealing, these ideas, for simplistic reasons. And this is going to be enough to get them out to vote. So I am not taking these ideas too seriously, even though they are seriously stupid, because I don't think that they are supposed to be taken seriously. I think that the real economic policies of a Harris administration will be the Biden economic policies, the continuation of the huge subsidies to green energy companies, the subsidies to favored corporations like the chip industry, and as Harris signaled today, potentially even the steel industry getting some major government investment and bailouts. So I think that's kind of the real message, is all that money is still waiting to be spent from the Inflation Reduction Act and other big spending bills. But the distraction to get people to the polls in November are these spurious, kind of ridiculous ideas like capping prices and taxing unrealized capital gains. I mean, I'm with Elliott. This is ridiculous.
I hope you're right, but what bothers me, Henry, is that both of the programs, the Reagan deal was basically moderate regulation, low taxes, sound money, and free trade. and that's gone.
Yes,
Under both these programs.
you're absolutely right.
The deal we've had since for the last 40, 50 years is gone. And why more people aren't talking about that, I don't know. But I agree. But here's the thing. Unless you have a split government, there's no guarantee that she's not going to try these things. And so, I don't want to bet my life that there'll be a split government and that so that they cancel each other out. So I look at these proposals and say this is the underlying concepts with which that she is working. Doesn't trust markets, hates corporate profits because she thinks it's a zero-sum game, doesn't think about what's going to increase output. That's what makes people richer. And that is disconcerting to me.
I totally agree, Elliott, and you're right that the big consensus, the neoliberal consensus essentially around restricted regulation, being fiscally responsible somewhat, and having free trade has completely collapsed on the left and the right. And it's very worrying. We're moving into completely uncharted waters where all these sorts of ideas that are, to be honest, not really serious ideas, they're getting thrown out there. Does anyone remember modern monetary theory? Until inflation spiked to almost 10%, we were being told that there was a new macroeconomic theory from Bernie Sanders' campaign called modern monetary theory, and governments could spend as much as they wanted without inflation. Well, no one's talking about it anymore, but the damage has been done. So all these ideas, the Pandora's box of economic ideas has been thrown open by the left and the right. They're just grabbing whatever they want out of there. We have to hope that they can't do too much damage. But I guess maybe I just don't have the stomach to engage with ideas that are quite this stupid at some point.
For me, the idea, the reason that I'm the most disappointed in the idea, candidly, isn't because I think she's going to implement it. It was Bush League. It's like it's the 101 class in politics. There are people like Larry Summers who work both for Obama as well as Clinton, who know that's a bad idea. If they'd have made one phone call, he would have told her how ridiculous an idea actually both of the two things in her program were. But more importantly, that he would have given her a way to talk to her constituency, because the way to talk to her constituency is to talk about, if you can't talk about entrepreneurs and big companies, then talk about entrepreneurs and small companies. The African-American woman who's struggling to make her bakery work, or the Hispanic fellow who's working hard to make his drywall company work. There are so many entrepreneurs in the minority community that face all these same challenges of regulation and taxation and the problems that come from it. And you can speak to them and your audience will love them. Bill Clinton was able to do it. Obama, to a lesser degree, was able to do it. But Larry Summers is someone that she knows. It's not that hard to make that type of a phone call. Now, as stupid as that idea was that I think she put out, I think an equally stupid one, I'm going to try to go back and forth on these so that we are balanced, is the idea of getting rid of an independent Fed. To me, that ignores the idea of where the Fed came about. If you look at the history of the Fed, I think it was in the 1917 that the Federal Reserve was actually formed. And it was formed because we had a series of collapses that happened within our currency. And so they were trying to figure out a banking model that actually would be more stable. It has worked in an amazing way, and they can do things at the federal level that are impossible for politicians to do, as we saw with Volcker, with Clinton. Now, I have a number of people that have, Bob, who you've written on it. Elliott, I know you worked with the bank. Let's start again with Elliott if we can. Elliott, regardless of what Trump put out on trying to get rid of the independence of the Fed, let's not dig into the nuances of that. Let's dig into the idea of, is it important that the Fed maintain their independence?
Absolutely. Again, it's run by humans. They're going to make mistakes. Okay, but at least they can correct their mistakes more quickly than Congress or the president would, because there'd be politics involved. If you take a look at the history of the U.S. economy prior to the Fed, it was like this. There'd be not recessions, but depressions about every 6-8 years. And that goes back as far as back to the 1780s when we were founded. The Fed has managed to smooth that over. Have they made mistakes? They made a terrible mistake in the 30s. They took what would have been a recession and turned it into a disaster. That was all on the Fed. It was also on taxing policy, but mainly the Fed and tariffs. But going forward, they've done an amazing job of keeping things fairly grounded. Are they allowing too much inflation? Yeah. By the way, if anybody thinks inflation was only 20% over the last 4 years, you better go take a look at how it's calculated, because it was much higher than that in reality. But the bottom line is the Fed has done a great job of keeping the economy afloat. In the mid-'70s, in the early '80s, and especially in 2000, after 2006-07, and during COVID, we would have had disasters in the last two. We would have had deep depressions were it not for the Fed. And they were inventive. They did whatever it took. And that's what kept us afloat. You have no idea what, I'll just tell you this. I talked back then, I was part of an economics group, a bunch of guys from around the country. We'd get calls every Monday. We were making bets on when the economy would collapse. And had not the Fed had not done what it did in 2008, in October of 2008, the economy would have simply imploded. The economy floats on a sea of credit. If that credit was not available, and that's where we were headed, the game's over. And so to me, without an independent Fed, if it's politicized, you have real problems. You can count, if it's politicized, you can count on much higher inflation as far as the eye can see.
And before I want to flip over to Bob on this, but I'd like to have you answer one more thing. So, like, I look back on the Carter years. I think I was just in high school when Jimmy Carter had become president. They ended up having, I think it was double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment, and double-digit interest rates, and it created a stagflation. Now, that was partially intentionally created by Paul Volcker, who was the head of the chairman, because he was worried about runaway inflation. Carter, I'm not sure if he wanted to push him into trying to change it or not, but if he did, he was ineffective at doing it. The upside is he really did curb inflation. Now, a couple of things, Elliott. Why is inflation?
By the way, let me correct one thing. It was Arthur Burns who allowed the money supply to grow. Volcker came in, and with Carter's approval and then Reagan's approval, really turned the screws and squeezed inflation out of the economy.
Well, that was what I had meant. I apologize if that wasn't what I was saying. But the point that I'm trying to get to is, A, that's hard for an elected official to do.
Yes.
Much more difficult for an elected official to do. And the second point that I would give on this is, and actually I'd like you to make it, why does it matter? Why not allow inflation to run away from itself? Why is it that that's such a massive concern of the Fed itself?
Well, the rule of 72s, if inflation is 2%, the cost of living doubles every 36 years. If it's 7%, it doubles every 10 years. If it's 10%, it doubles every 7.2 years. And so I'm very old. When I started at Valley National Bank in the late, actually 69, I'd cash a $20 check on Friday, and that was enough so I could take someone to the movies and go out to dinner. And that was my weekend. Try to do that for $20 today. Essentially, the dollar is basically worth about 8 cents. And yeah, it cost me about 20 times more to do that today. Actually, about 8 times more to do it today than it did in 1969. And that's true if you want to do something like that. It basically erodes your standard of living because inflation is eating up your wage gains. And so that's the real difficulty. It is very difficult to plan. It's very difficult to save because are you going to put your money in Treasury bills at 5% when the rate of inflation is like 8 or 9 or even 5? You're not gaining anything by saving. it's a disincentive. People tend to pull back. You think they'd go out and purchase everything now because prices are going up. That happens in hyperinflation. But if it's inflation's like 3, 4, 5%, people tend to contract rather than really buy in advance. So there's simply nothing good about it. And again, think about what it cost you for dinner today versus dinner in 2019 versus dinner when you were 21 years old, when you went out to dinner. And that basically is the best view of the world. Your money doesn't buy as much. You're running in place. And by the way, I should point out that when I was a kid, most families had one wage earner. Then you went to two wage earners because one wage earner couldn't bring in enough money. And now you're going to people who have two jobs and a second wage earner trying to keep up. This is mainly due to inflation and lack of productivity growth.
All right, Bob, you have you've expressed some criticism of the Feds in the past on fiscal policy or monetary policy, I guess I should have said, on monetary policy. I'm interested in hearing those points of view, but I'm also interested in hearing, do you think that the monetary system would be better if it was run by politicians as opposed to being run by the independent Feds?
I do believe that certainly post-2008, the Fed has mismanaged monetary policy. Having said that, its independence is vital. And its range of mistakes, even from a critic such as myself, is dramatically smaller than would be the case if they were subject to political influence. Elliott earlier provided an excellent list of the building blocks for economic growth and expanding opportunity. Added to that should be sound money, because if you don't know what the value of money is going to be in the future, you can't evaluate the risk that you're taking with an investment today. And so you want to narrow that range of potentially mistaken monetary policy. The only alternative that's ever been suggested for sound money, other than an independent central bank, is the Austrian philosophy of competitive currencies. And irrespective of the relative theoretical advantages of one or the other, we're not going back to competitive currencies in the United States. And when we had it, it didn't work out particularly well. So the independence of the Fed is essential to provide sound money guarantee, or at least likelihood, that's necessary for productive economic growth. And influenced by this particular politician, Donald Trump, would be doubly disastrous because he's an easy money guy. He left office lashing out at the Fed for not reducing already historically low interest rates just before, in my judgment, incontinent monetary policy, fueled by incontinent fiscal policy, erupted in a very serious inflation outbreak. And he wanted to compound right on the eve of that. So it's a bad idea, period. It's a particularly bad idea if the politician gaining influence is Donald Trump, if your goal is sound money over time.
Yeah, and it's that doesn't mean that the president doesn't have influence. He appoints the Fed chairman, and I believe he appoints 5 governors. The others are appointed by the banks. But once they're appointed, they play a role a little bit like a judge of being able to stay back and take a look at the issues and try to determine how to fix the problems. The 2 big problems it seems to me the Fed faces is inflation and deflation. Those are the two big things that they want to try to worry about and try to steer themselves as close to center as possible. But the one thing that I know from being a politician, if you're in the position of saying, hey, am I going to go ahead, even though I know it's in the best long-term interest of my country, to keep interest rates a little bit higher because it's going to slow things down because we're frothing a bit, or should I allow it to just go as fast as I possibly can and make myself look good? A politician's going to take choice B almost 100% of the time. They're rarely going to take choice A. They do not have a long-term view. The longest view they have is the next election. That is the longest view that they have. The idea that we created a Federal Reserve was a long-term view created by politicians who understood their own shortcomings, their own inability to be able to deal with it.
I would just return to this theme that Elliott brought up, which is that essentially a lot of sound economic ideas that had kind of been a bipartisan consensus for a long time are really being thrown out the window. I'd be interested in hearing the group's assessments of where this is all going to end up. I mean, I keep thinking back to the 1970s. This tends to be an era that keeps coming up time and time again. But of course, we live in a different time now. It could be that things end differently. But with all these bad economic policy ideas being thrown up in the air, where do people think this is going to end up? Personally, I think that there's a lot of inflationary pressure in all of these policy proposals. I think that really worrying because it means it's just that's people's number one concern. If you look at all the polling, is inflation, and yet all the policies we're seeing are actually probably going to make it worse. I think that really is not a good sign. I'd be interested to hear from everyone where they think that this is all going to end up, what the feedback mechanism is going to be through politics back to the economy, or what's going to happen.
I'll try to answer that first, and then the other two can certainly chime in on how they see it. I think it depends upon who loses. The loser in many ways is going to be more defining on the country than the winner. I would bet if the Democrats lose, they're going to go back to the left. That's just my bet. I believe if the Republicans lose, they're going to go back to the center. Now, the reason I believe that, if the Democrats lose, they're going to blame it on a whole bunch of other things other than the fact that Donald Trump had some popularity. He had some things that he was saying that obviously members of the public wanted. They dismiss him completely. They do not believe in any way, shape, or form he represents their values. And there is a very strong progressive part of the Democratic Party that had they have actually gone through a primary, I don't know that they wouldn't have had more control. I think that what Kamala was able to do in her speech partly happened because she didn't have a primary that she had gone through. Now, I'm speaking from someone, I became mayor without having to go through a primary election, right? I know you never have to go through a partisan primary, but there's no doubt it had a different effect on my thinking by not having to do that, by gaining an appointment as opposed to going through an election process. I then went through an election process. I ran for re-election, and that had a little bit of a different effect on me as well. If Trump loses, my own personal opinion is there's going to be a battle for the Republican Party. And the battle is going to come from the I'm going to call them the MAGA left, left. I don't know what's left or right anymore because of Donald Trump. So it's really hard to determine it. But the MAGA side and the more traditional, fiscally conservative Republican side. Now, maybe there ends up being some type of meld that happens between them. But just making my guess, there's a strong version in the Republican Party of the old conservative that Elliott was talking about a moment ago. And just imagine this. Just imagine Kamala as the president. And let's imagine they have the Senate, which I think all likelihood the Republicans will have the Senate. How do they gain traction? By saying that we need to be spending more money than she wants to spend? I don't think so. I don't think that's where they're going to gain traction. I think they're going to gain traction by talking about the deficits, by talking about the fiscal problem, by talking about how much money we're spending. And I think there will be consequences to some of the challenges that won't all be Kamala's fault because a lot of it's been happening for a while, but it won't matter because the president takes the heat for it, that will come from an era of big spending. So I think if Trump loses, I actually think some of these fiscal problems tend to get fixed. I think if Kamala wins and Trump loses, I think some of these fiscal problems get fixed. I think if the reverse happens, I think we're just delaying exactly what we're seeing today for another 4 years.
I once thought that Trump's defeat would trigger the fight for what the Republican Party stands for that you cited, Paul. I'm hopeful that occurs. I'm less sanguine about it than I formerly was. I have a feeling that fiscal irresponsibility is so cooked into the DNA of both political parties right now that it is only external events that will require our politicians to clean up the mess that they have created. And you will begin with a fight over an extension of the Trump tax cuts, and particularly whether those at the top are extended as well as those that most Americans benefit from, the extension of which was part of the Biden budget. I think we're treading a thin line on the willingness of the bond market to support increasing levels of federal government debt at even the elevated interest rates that they currently are at, which are roughly double what they were a decade ago. You have the impending inability of Social Security and the Medicare hospitalization fund to continue to pay benefits in roughly a decade, a little more than a decade. So you have all these external events there that may force a discussion that it's clear that nobody in either party wants to have.
And Bob, being as you brought up the Trump tax cuts, do you see the Trump tax cuts as being, because of the deficit problem, being a bad thing or a positive thing? I know there are many Republicans who think it doesn't matter how much taxes you cut, we'll continue to grow our way out of it because of the increased economic stimulus. There are others that look back at it like during the Clinton era and recognize that getting rid of some of the tax cuts actually helped get to a balanced budget. But your thought on it?
Well, 90% of the Trump tax cuts, there's agreement in both parties to extend. It is the top individual marginal tax rate and the corporate tax rate that's at issue between the parties. And the Trump cut the corporate income tax, and I think that's the most important one for purposes of this discussion, because that's what the largest increase would be if the Democrats got their way. Cut the corporate income tax from 33% for some corporations, 35% for others, down to 21%. That is at the average of European other countries. We had one of the highest corporate income tax rates among developed countries in the world. We got the federal rate back to the middle. But unlike the European countries, we also have state income taxes. So you add the state and corporate income tax rate, and we're still above the European average, which tends not to have sub-federal significant tax rates. The Democrats want to move that to 28%. You add an average of maybe 5% state income tax rate, and you're up over 30%, where the rest of the developed countries are at about 21%. That puts U.S. corporations at a huge disadvantage. It creates incentives to invert and sell U.S. corporations to Europeans. Another element of the Trump corporate tax cuts was to reduce the extent to which American corporations are taxed for money that they earn outside the country. That was also something that other developed countries don't do. And the Democrats want to bring back more of that. So from the standpoint of the production of our economy, I think it's important that the Trump corporate income tax rates be retained, but it does create a serious fiscal deficit that in some way needs to be ameliorated. But I don't think the answer is to go back to having one of the highest corporate income tax rates among developed countries in the world.
Okay. Now, Elliott, I'm going to give you that question, but I'm going to add one to it so that we start focusing back on Kamala as well. And the one on Kamala that I really want to focus on is this whole idea of, she called it price gouging, but I think there's some misunderstanding or at least disagreement in the political world as to, did she really mean price gouging? Did she really mean price caps? I don't want to get so much into the weeds on what her intent was on that, although I understand how important it is. What I really want to talk about is the idea of, can you really fix the problem by capping people at the top? And the area that I'd love for you to focus on is housing, because I think that's a huge issue. And to be fair, I think there are a lot of low-income people who got hit with big rent increases over the last 2 years, big rent increases over the last 3 or 4 years. And that had a significant impact on their life. And so many people locally in local markets all the way up now to what we've been hearing from the presidential candidate is this concept of, hey, we want to stop them from being able to gouge you or to put caps on the top of them to limit the amount that they're actually able to inflate their way through it. Can you help us understand this issue from an economic standpoint and also from the low-income person standpoint who's trying to make certain that they have an affordable rent?
Okay, let me start by saying that I hate to be on a program with 4 relatively smart guys, and we're all saying the same thing. Boy, we better hope there's a split government. Otherwise, we don't know what's going to happen. Okay, that's what I'm hearing. I agree with that. So I absolutely agree with Bob with the corporate tax rate. Kamala Harris bothers me because she obviously distrusts corporate profits and corporations. She is disingenuous. The reason we had the inflation we had is because Trump allowed too much money to go through, although had he not done that, we would have been in a depression. But the Biden-Harris tax cuts in 2021 were after the economy was improving and after things were getting back to normal. It's called helicopter money. He just throws it out. There's no increase in production to go along with it. So you get inflation. So to blame it on, look, even if Harris is going to blame it on an incredibly competitive market like groceries, where the margins are small, and she's saying that shouldn't be left to market forces, what industries is she going to let be left to market forces? That's what scares the hell out of me. That was about as hypocritical a thing as I've ever seen coming out of a politician, and we both know that everything most politicians say is hypocritical. So that's quite a statement. We have a fiscal problem. We have a huge fiscal problem because both parties are spending like there's no tomorrow. What Kennedy once said, that the time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. Well, the economy has been strong enough over the last few years that you should have fixed the fiscal roof, and they ignored it. They kept on pouring fire on that. We now have the lowest defense spending as a percent of GDP since 1939. So, and we're facing 3 adversaries at the same time. That could get ugly. I don't know how it gets fixed, and I don't know where you're going to get the political will until something bad happens to fix it. All that said, I don't like either candidate's economic policies, as I mentioned before. Now, as far as housing is concerned, housing went up for a lot of reasons. Housing went up, housing collapsed mainly because of affordability. Why were things less affordable? There is a shortage of supply. depending who you speak to, someplace between 2 and 7 million units in this country. 2 is probably closer to it, 2.5. Obviously, interest rates went through the roof. Commodity prices went through the roof. It was difficult getting washing machines, windows, flooring in from other countries because the U.S. doesn't produce that stuff anymore. It produces very little other than services, which is too bad. And so the price of housing escalated. The price of rents increased for those people renting because there wasn't enough supply brought on stream. There's going to be a temporary blip in supply where a lot is coming on now, and you're actually seeing rents go down a little. And I think that'll be the case through 2025. But we still are not even touching the problem. The major problem is twofold. One, interest rates. But the way we're describing things, at least temporarily, interest rates will go down. 2, though, it's the ratio of home price to incomes. Home prices have gone up much more than incomes. So even if interest rates come down, you're still going to have relatively expensive housing. Why is that? Well, the major reason is regulation. And regulation mainly at the local level, there is some at the federal level as well, having to do with CLOMARs and things like that. But in the city of Phoenix, for example, they're talking about increasing impact fees by $25,000 a house, which would completely do away with the benefit of any $25,000 gift the government gave to people who were first-time home buyers. It is an overregulated industry. They regulate anything from the size of the meter to the color of the house to just incredible number of things that weren't regulated 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. You were mayor, Paul. You probably ran into this as well. And I know
I even passed a few.
Yeah. And so those aren't going away. You're not going to get those type of tax increases that are invisible to the average person to go away. And so housing is going to be a major problem because it's going to take years to get enough new supply on stream to deal with the issue, to get supply demand back in balance. And I would suggest to you, you need more supply now than you did before because of the problem with impact fees and the ratio of housing price to incomes. So I'm optimistic that the housing market will do well, but it will not do well enough to get things, especially at the lower end of the spectrum, back into balance. I work with this group called Home Arizona, where we try to get politicians to understand that there is a problem and what the problem is. And most city councils get it, but I've been in front of city councils that are so busy patting themselves on the back because they allowed an apartment building in an area they didn't allow it before, than focusing on the real issue. What's the supply-demand balance for our city and our metropolitan area? And so am I optimistic about affordability? It'll improve from here. Will it get back to where it was? I doubt it.
Yeah, I could fill this show with stories from both sides. But before we go deeper into the regulation side, and again, we've got a show planned in the future on this one, but if you would, rent controls. Why isn't that just an easy answer? What's the effect of stepping in and saying, hey, we're just going to make certain that you guys don't gouge people on rents, and we're going to put rent controls in place?
No, rent controls have been tried, and except for very short term, rent controls have never worked anywhere they've tried. What you're doing is you're basically preventing people from building new units because they can't get any return on their investment. So essentially, you're exacerbating the shortage. If you want to take it to where the full extreme, there's a reason that Brooklyn and the Bronx were basically war zones back in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. And that's because New York kept on the rent controls that were put on during World War II when World War II ended. And people were walking away from buildings because they couldn't even get enough rent to cover the property taxes. So they just walked, and those areas turned into disasters. Now they've gone away from that, and those areas are being regentrified. Brooklyn, even the Bronx, is being regentrified. But the one thing I can guarantee you is if you put on rent controls, you're going to have shortages. And there's no two ways around it. The only way to deal with this is basically get as many buildings of any type built. We are short of housing of all types, at all income levels, and at all price points. And the more you have at any of those, the more you're going to have lower rents all the way down the line. And it's difficult because it's not a federal government decision. It's not entirely a local government decision, but it's a government decision. And that means there's politics involved, and it's going to take years to remedy.
Yeah, and this is what I saw from the regulatory side. And I'll deal with this both from the private sector and from government. First, from the governmental side, the only people who really ever showed up at our desk, at our office, were people who wanted more regulations. I can't tell you that I ever was lobbied by anyone to lower the amount of regulations. Interestingly enough, the pressure for more regulations sometimes came from the industry and oftentimes came from, let's just call them the neighborhoods, or from people who wanted more regulations on signs, or more regulations on what was going to happen in the lot across the street from me, or people who were concerned about environmental regulations. But oftentimes they came from incumbents. It shouldn't be lost on people that if you think about rental units, there are people who rent units and there are people who build units that sell to people who rent units. The people who build and sell to people who rent units, they want less regulation. But if you're someone who actually is owning the unit, regulations are good because it reduces the overall supply. And if you reduce the overall supply, what happens to the price? The price goes up. So the industry itself is divided. Now, that's just a political observation from having watched it as mayor over a number of years and trying to figure out, wait. Why am I getting a different response from different types of people who are in the development space? On the other side, my son right now is building a 35-unit complex. He's built a number of different subdivisions. This is a fact. To get from start to finish, the construction period of time that it will take for him to build those 35 units, about 9 months. If you took out the inspection time, it would be down to about 6 months. So meaning the inspection time delays the construction process. And I could go through the details with you, but just for now anyway, take it as a matter of fact, that is what happens. But what's more important is that the regulatory side, just the permitting process, takes anywhere up to 2 years. And if you add zoning on top of that, meaning if you don't have zoning, add another 18 months on top of it. You're going to be anywhere between 24 and 48 months to get a project done. Well, the problem with that are cycles. Right? So if you have a 48-month cycle and you're not sure whether or not you're at the end of the economic cycle, you might start that project just in time to go bankrupt, right? Because if the market goes bad, you're going to be stuck there with an inability to be able to rent the houses out and to pay off the underlying construction loan and everything else. And then coming into a new market becomes a challenge because the resources aren't there to make it happen. The point I'm giving, the more time that you put on that, the harder it is for the private sector to be able to respond. If the private sector knew there was a 9-month cycle to get in and out, or maybe even a 10 or 12-month cycle to get in or out, it becomes a much more secure bet for them, and you will increase supply in a more orderly way. What I've seen is, and by the way, I think Phoenix, we've done business all over the country. My son has, and my brothers have. I have a number of brothers that are in this space as well. Phoenix is probably one of the better cities. It's not one of the worst, and they're a lot worse, right? But it's one of the better cities. In saying that, there are so many regulations there. I guarantee you this. There are only 1 or 2 people who can really describe it to you in the city of Phoenix. It's so complex They can't tell you how to get through it. You just have to have it built on a little bit of faith and then hope that somebody will take the time to help you steer through it, because all the time you'll end up in these dead blocks where they've told you to do something, you've done it the way that they've told you to do it, only to find another problem down the line that throws you off.
I'm actually a little bit optimistic on this particular subject. I think there is a growing recognition about the need to deregulate fairly dramatically housing regulations. And it is increasingly bipartisan. In Arizona, a lot of Democrats voted for a bill that would have radically deregulated zoning in the state. And both Obama and Harris addressed the need for some kind of deregulation in the housing market in order to facilitate the expansion in supply that you and Elliott have mentioned. So I do believe there is some political momentum to move in the right direction on this particular subject.
I agree with Bob. There is a change, but I think the most valuable thing about this exchange between you and Elliott, Paul, is just to get under the hood of the actual decisions by the people that are actually building these units, right? And that gets lost in a lot of political discussions, and people have to understand what's actually going on. And you could apply the same logic to the supermarket chains, right? Paul, you were just describing how difficult it is to get a new housing unit built and all the permitting, etc. And the investor is worried, are they going to actually even end up making any money at the end of this? And there's a lot of uncertainty. The same holds for supermarket sector. You know, they're looking at building new supermarkets. They're looking at rolling out new products. There's no certainty about whether they're going to make any money. There's really intense competition from any number of other actors in the supermarket space. And so this one-sided or extremely simplistic view that there are all these profits being made and it's a sure thing for all these investors and it's really unfair is just absolutely not capturing the reality of what's going on, and therefore not capturing the real problems. And so it's really excellent that we had this conversation here on the show, because people have to understand the problems before they can start understanding what sort of solutions are going to help. And simply capping prices, simply throwing government money at a problem is not necessarily going to address any of the actual issues at stake, and may even make things worse in some cases.
Oh, I can tell you, if they double or quadruple the amount of money that's put into, let's call it affordable housing or subsidized housing, they won't make an effect of 1% on the overall housing market. The housing that's going to be built is going to be built by the private sector. It's just that simple. And at least in my experience, here's what I can tell you. There is a gross misunderstanding of the private sector and in government. And when I say that, I'll be critical of myself. I became councilman at 25 and mayor at 30 years old. How much do you really think I understood about the free market? Now, I was smart enough to try to listen to people like Elliott and other people who did have a better understanding of it. But the point that I'm giving is that you don't have the faith in it. You keep thinking, hey, I've got problem A, B, or C, and I'm smart enough to fix it. The answer is you're not supposed to fix every problem. There are many problems that are going to be fixed by the private sector, and government ought to try to fix the problems that it has to fix. The military, or how do we make certain that our schools work better than they're working today? So I'm going to take this now back to Trump. All right, because one of the things that I saw with Trump that was bothersome to me on the free market is I've always believed one of the most powerful things that we have with the private sector is the rule of law, that in many respects, companies and individuals have certain rights that are actually higher than the rights of government. But I've been watching on the Republican side, this has probably always existed to some degree on the Democratic side, but it's disturbing to see it begin to devolve on the Republican side. The idea that they're going after companies that don't agree with them ideologically. It seems to me that that's something that we're seeing an increase of, where there's less dependence on the rule of law and a much greater dependence upon the idea of, if these companies aren't falling in line with the ideology, then they're companies that we ought to go after politically and attack. Do you think I'm misreading that? That to me seems to be an observation.
I don't think that you're raising a false alarm at all. And even when in Trump's previous term, he had occasion where he, in essence, ordered companies to do something, not close a factory in a place where he had campaigned about keeping the factory open. So I do not think that there is, in the Republican Party, a respect for the rule of law as Hayek defined it for economic purposes, which is that all economic actors know what the rules are in advance, and the rules are applied evenly and equally to all economic actors. The Republicans do believe in using some corporations as political whipping boys, and Trump evinced the willingness to act as sort of an authoritarian in instructing companies as to what they should do with regard to non-political, purely economic decisions.
Trump is a threat to the rule of law. I think he certainly likes to run roughshod over a lot of norms, issue dictates to the private sector, question the independence of the Fed, and on January 6th, to a certain extent, provoke this kind of lawless uprising at the Capitol and the disruption of the presidential election. I think for sure he doesn't care about these sorts of norms. But on the other hand, there has also been a legal campaign against him by the Democrats and a lot of elected Democratic legal officials across the country. And so to return to my general theme, I think that there's plenty of blame to go around on both sides. And just as worried as I am about the Pandora's box of economic policy that seems to be thrown open once we deviate from a set of consensus, common sense economic policies, I'm actually kind of worried about the Pandora's box of legal warfare, extra legal political intervention in the economy, etc., that could be thrown open as we move forward as well. I think probably like a lot of people, I wish we would come back to some sort of normal equilibrium where people agree to just keep out of certain things. But part of the era that we're living through is just that all these norms have been thrown out the window and we're moving into uncharted territories. So I think a lot of us would hope that if Trump loses the election, then the warfare against Republican candidates, as well as these sort of extra legal interventions in the private sector would cease. But I'm not sure really whether they would.
All right, Elliott. So I'm going to leave two questions, and this will be our last one. Certainly, I'd love to have your answer on the whole idea of the rule of law. But I'd like some help in breaking down is this idea of tariffs. Now, again, Trump has his own proposal, but I'd like to focus on the concept from an economic standpoint. The idea of putting tariffs on everyone throughout the world, creating a trade war with England and Canada and just about everybody else that you can imagine, New Zealand, to make certain that Henry's group isn't left out of it. Why not? Why not just go out and say, hey, we need more income, we need more taxes. We're going to take all of you folks who are in these outlying areas in these other countries, and we're going to charge a tax for you to be able to sell goods into the United States. I would guess that the theory is that that's going to not only raise more income, but it's going to also ensure that there are more jobs through kind of a mercantilist type strategy where people will begin to create those goods here as opposed to there. I mean, my guess is that that's the overall theory. Help me break this down and understand, at the end of the day, are tariffs really good for us? Is it something that we may benefit from, or is there a more significant downside than the upside that exists?
Let me make one comment before I get to tariffs. In that, if you remember back to 2008, Obama de facto took over General Motors and was running it as if he was CEO. I'll talk about he did that a lot in that period of time. I'll talk about other government victories like Solyndra, where they basically burned through hundreds of millions of dollars for no reason. How about the EV fiasco we're now having in this country because of government? You can't have government allocate resources. When every day you go out and vote with your money, billions of people, billions of votes, and they are voting for what they want. Okay, and so what you get is what the collection overall, a collection of what people think is best for them. Government sector, no way. It's allocation for political purposes by some bureaucrat. Doesn't work. It might take years or decades before the government even recognizes it made a mistake and more or less corrects it. Private sector, you don't have to worry about a company making a mistake because its competitors will discover his mistake for him. So the only thing I can tell you is there's only two words that I can think of that talk about where we're headed, and those two words are banana republic, and on both sides, because of what Henry mentioned with how they ate up Trump's 4 years with lawsuits and other nonsense, but on Trump's side because of his strong arming. But that's neither here nor there. All right, getting back to tariffs. Tariffs, in general, we charge fewer tariffs than we are charged, but not by a lot. It's in the tenths of 1%. And so to add 20% to 20%, 10 or 20% to those tariffs would be bad, but wouldn't be a disaster. But if he's talking about 10 percentage points, that's a disaster. You can't do that.
What's the difference? I don't understand.
Okay, right now, the world's at about 1.5% tariffs. We're at about 1.25. So there's about a 20% difference overall. And so we can live with that. It's essentially a free trade world at this point. If you start getting into a trade war where you're going to kick it up a lot in the attempt to bring companies back here and create jobs for Americans, two things are going to happen. One, if it's a static world, you're creating inflation for Americans, at least until they adjust to those higher prices that are caused by tariffs. And it's going to take a while for companies to move here. But it's not a static world. You'll have trade wars, and that's bad for everybody. It's still a small world. It's still a world where international trade is now the rule and not the exception. And to attack that, boy, I don't like that at all. I'll also tell you that because you do have to increase tariffs on those countries that are subsidizing their goodies, like on China. They would dump the hundreds of thousands of excess vehicles they have made and are sitting in empty pieces of land in China. They would dump those here in a minute at a price where American manufacturers couldn't compete. We can't allow that. And so you have to tariff the hell out of those type things. If a government is subsidizing an industry, you have to level a playing field. Steel, perhaps. I don't know the details of steel. All I know is we've gone from a country where we produce all sorts of stuff to a country where we don't produce anything. No toys, no furniture, no. We don't produce anything. And that's scary. I don't like that at all. So, do I like tariffs? His tariff plan? No. By the way, I'll also say I don't like the huge deficits. And the free traders say, well, it doesn't matter because those people will basically come here and buy American goods. That's not true. What they're buying is America. They're no longer buying American goods. They're balancing the trade deficit and the fiscal deficit internationally by buying America, by buying American companies, by buying American real estate, by buying American everything, stocks, bonds. That's not the way the theory works. But the bottom line is that it's a bad idea. He would have been much better to say we have some imbalances that we need to correct because certain industries are being subsidized by the government of a certain country. We can't allow that. That's not fair. But the 10 to 20% number is silly. I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah, there was a study done during the Bush administration, the last Bush administration, where they'd put a tariff on steel coming in. They said, okay, we want to try to build up our own steel industry in the United States. And so we're going to basically create a large tax on people on the outside to ensure that that you're using our steel. Now, the study that was done that was fascinating was that it showed we actually increased by a few thousand people, the amount of people working in the steel industry. But they were mostly lower income jobs. On the other hand, we dramatically lost jobs at companies like Boeing. I think it was over 80,000 engineers that we ended up losing. Why? Well, because all of a sudden they couldn't compete with Airbus or with other outside groups who were producing airplanes at a cheaper price because they had cheaper steel. So there's so many interactions with the private sector. You think you can just put a tax on one thing, but it becomes a whack-a-mole problem. All of a sudden, another problem happens somewhere else. And as the prices continue to increase, if you're the one that's simply taxing those goods, you're not just taxing it to the consumers. You're taxing the steel now to the guy who produces screws. Right now, all of a sudden, the guy who's producing screws can't produce screws as cheap as the guy who's producing screws outside the United States.
One of the things that turned the recession of 1929 into a disaster were the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930, which had tremendous increases in tariffs. And we got into a trade war, and international trade just shrunk like crazy. That's what would happen. It doesn't make sense. Are there good reasons for certain tariffs? Absolutely. Across the board, that doesn't make any sense at all to me.
Bob, you probably may not remember this article because you wrote it a long time ago, but it's one that I really liked, and it was on the whole idea of mercantilism. The idea that there was a period of time in world history where there was this belief the only thing that mattered was that you export goods and you import gold. And the mercantilist strategy was the main strategy. It seems to me that there's been a huge advantage to us moving to kind of the Adam Smith wealth of nations concept, but where we believe we can actually build commerce here internally. Give me your thoughts, if you would, about not only the economic components to this, but maybe equally as important, what effect do you think this begins to have on our allies and our relationships with people who, at least heretofore, haven't been on the opposite side of the U.S.?
I believe in the benefits of free trade. I believe that mercantilism is based upon a fallacy. I don't think there's a problem as a general proposition in the U.S. getting cheaper goods from foreign manufacturers. And I'm among those that Elliott criticized who don't think that trade deficits as a general proposition matter. I think foreign investment in the United States is a good thing as a general proposition. Not a bad thing. And I think that the rules of comparative advantage, where we concentrate on those things that we produce more efficiently than people in other countries and exchange goods that they produce more efficiently than we do, is generally correct. And in addition to the economic consequences that Elliott described, the geopolitical consequences of an across-the-board tariff would be almost incalculable. Even with the selective tariffs that both the Trump and Biden administration have imposed, have created significant frictions with our allies and run contrary to what I thought was a useful concept, although difficult to implement, about friend-shoring our supply chain. It's tough to do that when you're trying to put tariffs in certain respects. I make a giant exception to free trade, not mercantilism, for China. I think that the geopolitical consequences of China justify trying to insulate our economy to the maximum extent possible to influence from China. And that would cause me to consider things that I normally oppose, which is tariffs on Chinese goods and even subsidizing in certain places American companies to replace the competitive advantage that the Chinese have. Understanding how fraught that is with miscalculation and how you cannot completely insulate the U.S. economy from influence to China. But I believe geopolitically, we should have the strategy of insulating our economy from Chinese influence to the maximum extent possible. So I'm sort of a free trader, except for China.
Henry, so I'm going to give you not only that question, but I'm going to add one to it because this is going to technically be the last question. I am interested specifically because I think oftentimes you see things from a foreign policy. You have the ability to look at from the outside in, what you think a tariff policy that would, what effect it would have on our relationships around the world. But I'm going to add the last question for you also so you can answer them both at the same time. We have a debate coming up. The debate is, I think, is September the 8th, if I have that date correctly. We'll put up the date down at the bottom, but that debate is going to be between Trump and Harris. Give me your predictions on that debate and what your thoughts are on it as well, because we're going to come back on with our next program right after the debate.
All right, great. On tariffs and this question in general, I think that free trade is a good thing for the United States and a good thing for the world in general, same as Bob and Elliott. But I also don't think that the United States public is really in favor of free trade anymore. I think that's one of the reasons why Trump got elected. I think that's one of the reasons we're seeing this, like I said, move away from all these consensus policies, the opening of a Pandora's box. I think that one of the reasons that free trade was so successful after World War II was because it was essentially tied to national security and tied to U.S. military alliances. The GATT, as it was before the 1980s and the 1990s, started as a club of rich, developed countries that had won the war and were not under the specter of communism. I think it might be smart for American policymakers to think about recreating something like that wasn't explicitly only anti-China, but that really focused on America and its core allies and created networks of economic cooperation and interdependence and prosperity among those allies explicitly. I think that could probably get the buy-in of the American public more than the current trade regime, which is global and worked fine when the United States was the global hegemon, but has been faltering ever since. So that's my view on free trade, is that it should probably be multilateral but tied to structures of alliances and to natural affinities that there are among the rich developed countries, the usual suspects of the North Atlantic, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, parts of Latin America, and Southeast Asia. I think that would probably work pretty well. The debate, I was always so dubious about this Trump-Biden debate. I thought that it was going to be so boring because it was going to be so tightly managed and controlled. And then, I always had a caveat that there could be a big moment, but something would have to go badly wrong for there to be a big moment. And I guess I was right. And that something did go really wrong for Biden. And it was a huge moment, right? This was actually a world historical moment, that first debate. So I think I'm going to say the same thing about this debate. I think that we already know everything about Trump. He's going to do what he's going to do. He's probably going to say some stupid things, and he's not actually that great at debating. So he's going to miss a lot of opportunities to attack where he could, and it's going to be somewhat strange all over. People don't know as much about Kamala Harris, although we know a decent amount. And she's going to be very, very well prepared. And so I think it's the same constellation, right? Is that we're probably not going to learn a lot. It's probably not going to change the trajectory of the election that much unless something goes majorly wrong for either candidate. And there, this role of unpredictability comes in. And I have no idea what could trip up either or the other one. But if something does, and there's a viral video moment of something going very badly wrong, that could change the race. But otherwise, I think we're probably just going to learn a little bit more about what we already knew about both of the candidates, and it won't really change things. So I guess I'm not that interested in it. It'll be worth watching, and if something goes wrong, then it could be really interesting.
Yeah, I think what's fascinating about something going wrong is there's only one side that something could go wrong for. Trump could walk up and shoot the moderator in the face with a gun, and he's going to still get the same amount of votes that he was going to get before.
I think you're right. There is an asymmetry. There's an asymmetry in the risk. But nonetheless, Harris also will be very well prepared. She'll have her remarks.
Yeah.
Something would have to go really wrong for her to mess this up.
Yeah, I think the risk is definitely more on her side. Elliott, your thoughts on the debate? Are you going to be watching it, and what effect do you think it's going to have on the election?
I absolutely will be watching it, and I absolutely agree with everything that Henry said. I don't think I can add to it. We'll see who trips up, or if anybody. I think it's more likely that Trump will continue to make ridiculous statements that are unpresidential. It'll make him look bad, and that Harris will be well trained, and hopefully for her she will, because I don't think she's very good on just off the cuff. But she'd have to mess up really badly to have a negative effect on her. I agree with Henry.
All right. So, Bob, I'm going to let you go last, and here's why. Because in our last prediction on the last debate, I was almost 100% wrong, and you were almost 100% right. My comment was that there was a way that Trump could win this debate by who we might appeal to. You responded to that Trump is going to be who Trump is, and there's no way he's going to change for anyone. And I thought that in both cases they would overperform as opposed to underperform. God, was I wrong on that one? I mean, it was terrible how bad it was. I think this debate is maybe the single most important thing in this election. I look at the polling today. My own personal opinion is that Harris has to be ahead by at least 3 points in the national polls to be able to win in the swing states. I also think that Trump overperforms the polling. He did it in 2016. He seemed to do it again in 2020, which says to me this is a very tight race in those 5 or 6 states. And as I said in the past, we're talking about 200,000 to 400,000 voters that are really the ones making the decision. Almost all the rest of this is baked in. I do think that when I'm watching Kamala, I think she actually is starting to try to appeal to the center. I noticed it was very obvious to me in her speech after she made the gas on her economic proposal. She didn't talk about her economic proposal in her Democratic speech to the convention. I noticed on Israel, she took a more middle ground and tried to say, hey, we need to support Israel in defending itself, but we also need to make certain that we care about human life. I saw movement from at least her speech's standpoint towards the center. But if Kamala blows this, if she either goes left or if something happens to her where she has a major gaffe and something goes wrong, I think she actually could lose this. I doubt seriously that she's going to leave this debate being a major winner, but I think she could leave this debate being a major loser. And that's where expectation comes in. All of us expect Trump to be Trump. There isn't anything he couldn't do that isn't already as outlandish as anything he's ever done. But with Kamala, our expectations are very high. We've watched someone who seems to be more positive, who seems to be talking about politics in a different way. She's talking about joy. She's created an aura or a vibe, as they like to say in their campaign. Well, debates aren't about vibes. Debates are about having to address issues. And if Trump isn't able to intervene, then the moderator is going to be able to be very direct with the questions, and she's going to have to answer them. The expectation being high is probably not going to be met. And that's probably going to be a little bit of suffrage for Kamala at the end of it. I don't know that ends the campaign just because she doesn't do as well as we expected. I think it could be damaging for her campaign if she had a major gaffe. But nonetheless, I think this debate's very important in this election. Your thoughts?
There's a fascinating byplay going on about the details of the debate. When it was Biden versus Trump, Biden's camp insisted that the mics be muted, except when the candidate was talking. In this debate, the Harris campaign is arguing to unmute the mics to make it a free-for-all. And it's the Trump campaign that's arguing to keep the mics muted. I think this is part of the Harris campaign strategy, not of seeking swing voters on the basis of policy, although she's trying to make herself more acceptable by jettisoning some of the more radical positions that she supported as a presidential candidate last time around, but to appeal to the voters on the basis of personality. And I think they want Trump's mic unmuted in order to continue making their case to the swing voters that he's just too much of a cad to be president. And so I do think there's larger risks for Trump in this, even though he is fully baked in, based upon what I perceive to be the appeal that the Harris campaign is relying upon in order to get swing voters, which isn't on relative policy. It's on relative personality. So, and that issue hasn't been resolved yet, to my knowledge, as to whether the mics are going to be muted or unmuted.
Yeah, fascinating. All right. I hate it when you disagree with me because that means I could be wrong a second time. All right, everybody. So we will be back right after that debate and we'll have a further discussion on it. But thanks for all your input on this issue today.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.